Hey everyone, I'm Elena with Women Who Drone. Thanks so much for joining us today for our introduction to pilot operations with Danielle De Leon. We are so excited to bring this virtual workshop to you to learn everything you need to know to get started as a drone pilot. So I'm going to introduce our speaker and our teacher today, and then I will give her the floor. So Danielle De Leon is a specialized female drone pilot, photographer, and yoga instructor based in Montana. She works on a diverse range of projects from commercial, editorial, VR, documentaries to feature films. She started with FPV Racers in 2014 and is one of a few females to fly octocopter for VR, which is really cool. She has worked with companies such as National Geographic, Google, UN Women, Disney Plus, BBC, HBO, and many others. We are so excited to have you, Danielle. Welcome.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to jump right into this topic today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we'll get started. So today we're going to be talking about an introduction to pilot operations. These are just going to be essential flight tips or practical tips rather, and flight protocol essentials that you should keep in mind to not only help your operations go a little bit more smoothly, but also to actually reduce your crash rate, which everybody could benefit from that. So our agenda today is going to include a little introduction on who I am. We'll dive into why pilot operations matter, or being aware of operations is important. And then we'll start looking into some of the factors that really affect our operation, such as risk elements, pilot roles, documentation, environmental considerations, and external variables. Towards the end, I'm going to give you guys a couple of flight simulations to take home and practice, maybe even tonight or tomorrow or over the weekend. Then we'll get into some final thoughts and open up for a Q&A. So a little bit about me. My name is Danielle De Leon. I have my own company called Pilot EQ. Although I have roots in photography, I really got pulled into videography and camera operations back in 2014. I started working with a Schedule 333 exemption company. And essentially that was the very first commercial drone license that you could attain from the FAA. However, they required that you had a manned aircraft license in order to commercially fly drones. So I worked for someone else who was a manned pilot. He built the drones, he flew the drones, and I did a lot of the camera operations and editing primarily. But he saw that on the horizon, they would start changing regulations and really pushed me and encouraged me to start flying mini drones. And then ultimately, I actually started building FPV racers and flying those on my own as a hobbyist. I even had the opportunity to work as a sales rep at a drone distribution company. So that's a company called quadrocopter.com. And that's where I learned a lot about the technology and very specifically the cinema application of using these aircraft. I've been so lucky to not only travel all over the world for specifically flying drones for videography, but I've also had the opportunity to work with some very notable companies. So that has just given me a lot of understanding on industry standards and different settings, and how, as a remote pilot, I fit into a crew or a film group, which is insanely beneficial and definitely different than doing shoots on your own or for your own creative reasons. I've been super fortunate to also fly larger aircraft such as hexacopters and octocopters, which can be seen in these photos here. And I was even hired to fly hexacopters and octocopters with a VR camera underneath for National Geographic and Google. So those have just ultimately really up the ante, because you can't have landing gear on those units since the camera is filming 360 degrees. So usually you're landing and taking off from a cage, which you can see in that upper picture in the corner there. And all of a sudden, the potential for a crash skyrockets and your risk starts to really go just amp up. And so being a proficient pilot is a necessity. Diving into now our topic of the day, why operations actually matter. Well, it's something that all remote pilots interact with, whether you're flying recreationally or flying for a commercial application. Ultimately, it's also going to increase your efficiency when you're flying. I'm sure everyone can relate to that feeling of the clock counting down or your battery counting down as soon as you start flying. And ultimately, when you pay attention to your operations, it can help make your flight patterns and your routes a little bit more efficient, and also making the time that you spend in the air more efficient. It can also contribute to some industry standardization. And so being aware that as a remote pilot, you are representing the industry as a whole when you're out there flying. And so being conscientious of your operations and how you hold yourself is also just hugely important to create some industry standardization. But first and foremost, I think everybody will love the fact that you can actually reduce your crash rate when you start paying to your operations. There are an incredible amount of spontaneous circumstances that could possibly come up when you're flying, and being prepared to handle those not only gives you the opportunity as a pilot to challenge yourself, but it also creates an opportunity to explore very diverse environments and very diverse settings for you to fly your drone in. And then ultimately, you're interacting with nature. So being mindful of how you might be affected by nature, but most importantly, how we might affect nature and other animals around us. So we're going to dive right in, first talking about the 4 risk elements. So anytime that you encounter a situation while flying, you're going to see these risk elements at play. The 4 risk elements are pilot, aircraft, environment, and external pressures. All of these are contributing to your situation. And ultimately, when you're paying attention to these 4 risk factors, you can increase your situational awareness, which is a pretty key word, situational awareness. Pilot roles. Pilot roles are pretty important to be considerate of, since we are actually the ones flying the drone and manipulating it. It's easy to think that the aircraft is in control or that there's a lot of attention on the aircraft, but I think that it gets overlooked at how big of an influence a pilot can have. It's a pilot role to be considerate of those things that are happening around you and to have that situational awareness. But it's also really important for a pilot to be able to manage tasks, maybe even delegate certain tasks, and then foster communication, maybe not only with the team, but other people who might be curious about what you're up to. Being aware of how you as a pilot are mentally interacting with the world is also very important. So the FAA provides what they call an I'm safe checklist. And this is a actual crash reduction technique that is also taught to manned aircrafts. But in this I'm safe checklist, we can start to identify different variables that come up with us as individual pilots. And so I being for illness, M, medication, S, stress, A, alcohol, F, fatigue, and E, emotion. I'm sure that if you were to think about these all individually, you might be able to become more aware of how these interact with us and influence our decision making, especially stress and fatigue. Those seem to be some of the bigger ones that, as a remote pilot, I have personally experienced while being out on set. But then there's also something called hazardous attitudes. And if you have not taken your Part 107 commercial test yet, this is something that you will see on there. And this is something that is a crash reduction technique. So being able to recognize hazardous attitudes is a crash reduction technique. There are 5 of those. You have anti-authority, impulsivity, invulnerability, macho, and resignation. All these attitudes can be tolerated when we're moving in our day-to-day life. And you might notice it when people display these attitudes, or you might even be able to acknowledge when you yourself have displayed these attitudes. But it's important to be aware when you're out on set, either how you might be bringing these attitudes in or how other people you're interacting with might bring these to the crew dynamic. So these are kind of just tapping into the idea of pilot roles and how us as pilots, not only what our duty, so to say, is as a remote pilot, but also that we get to be the ones to kind of foster this communication and awareness around these things when it comes to the culture of the people that are involved. Moving into some documents, which we'll talk a little bit about some of these components individually coming up. But in general, when you're out flying, you're going to want to have proof of your drone registration, potentially insurance, depending on what you're doing, checklists, logbooks, or a logbook, your UAS license if you have one, any certificate of waivers or airspace authorization. Now, to start off with this discussion, just moving into drone registration, which is something that you're going to need even if you are just a recreational pilot. And you're going to need it if your aircraft specifically weighs over 250 grams or 0.55 pounds. This registration applies to all aircraft above that weight up to 55 pounds. Once you go over 55 pounds, you get into a little bit of a different category of aircraft. So there is a little bit of a different process you would go through to get that registration. But even if you're flying recreationally, you're going to want to have some proof of that registration. Same with checklists, logbooks, but ultimately insurance, certificate of waivers, and airspace authorizations, those things seem to fall more in line with a commercial pilot. And so if you're flying around and, potentially are working on another film crew or flying around houses, it would be a terrible situation to deal with your drone crashing and causing an extensive amount of damage to a house or a vehicle or, worst case scenario, a person. And so here's where that liability insurance can be very, very helpful, even if you are a recreational pilot potentially. So breaking these down a little bit, we'll dive into some of those topics specifically a little bit more. So first on the list, we'll discuss checklists. Checklists can be short and simple or quite extensive, which is what you see on the screen. I do have a more full checklist to send everybody or to provide to everybody so that you can see kind of that high efficiency, marking everything through just in case your mind is all over the place or you're distracted or you're juggling a bunch of things. It can be helpful to have these checklists in front of you so that you can take a little bit of that thought process and brain work out of it. But ultimately, it's just going to help make sure and ensure that you have a successful operation without hiccups and without forgetting anything when there are so many other things to be considering as a remote pilot. When you first show up on site, you're going to be looking around and trying to identify any obstacles that might come up, but you're also going to want to be aware of what's happening in that airspace, which we'll talk about a little bit more. And some of these things can be done before you get on site. You can use Google Earth and other map programs to help you see what's going on in that area and really plan where you're going to be landing and taking off, and even planning if you need to do an emergency landing where that might happen. Then once you actually start to go through setting up your aircraft, there are things to be aware of, like looking at your, transmitter, looking over your aircraft, making sure your props are clear, that there's no bumps or cracks on your batteries, that your camera lens is clean, all these little things, that you have an SD card, that it's formatted, so on and so forth. You're going to do an aircraft inspection overall, and then you're going to be ready to take off. And once you start to go and take off, generally it's helpful to give a little bit of stick input, see where you're at, make sure your aircraft is responding to you as you would expect it to, and that you're able to get a nice clear transmission feed so you know what's going on. And then when you come back down to the ground and you're ready to pack up and move on for the rest of the evening, you're going to be doing an aircraft inspection, making sure that your battery is okay, making sure everything's turned off, and putting everything away in a safe place. Then you can also review the footage on a lot of these aircrafts, which is wonderful, and just make sure that you got everything that you're going to need before you leave the location. So I've very quickly summarized up some of those main points, which is an effective checklist on its own if you want to write one out. But what you see in front of you is much more extensive. Again, it's going by check, every little detail. So it's helpful to acknowledge what you might need as a pilot and what kind of support might be most helpful for you when you're out on site. Then getting into the discussion of logbooks. Logbooks are an attribute of being a remote pilot that I feel is quite heavily overlooked. However, if you do have a DJI aircraft, and I'm sure other aircrafts might have this as well, you might see some level of a flight log in your app. And that's going to be documenting things like your location, what altitude were you at when you took off, how high did your drone fly, how fast has it gone, what was the total duration of flight time, things like this. But if you do start operating on a more commercial level, especially larger aircraft beyond quadcopters or aircrafts with 4 propellers, anytime you get into something bigger than that, or if you're working with really high-end clients, they might want some more information than just what that DJI flight log has to offer. So I personally actually just use Excel, and I couple that with my DJI flight log. Ultimately, when I'm typing information into this Excel sheet, there are a couple of things that I'm really actually paying more attention to than others. You might put information like the date, the time, the location, if you have any crew members with you or potentially a visual observer on site. And then of course, flight duration. But really what we're looking to log is things such as accidents, maybe even flight abnormalities, such as if your aircraft isn't responding how you would expect, or if you accidentally nicked a branch on a tree. Even if it doesn't cause your aircraft to fall down out of the sky, it's worth taking a note in your logbook, just in case something comes up in the future and you need to refer to it. If you do have a lot of batteries, it could be helpful to even ID your batteries and put little labels on them so you know which is which, and you can include this in your flight log. So if something were to happen during a flight, you know which battery it was. And later on down the road, let's say you have a battery problem come up, you'll be able to identify if there's been any contributing factors to that incident. You also might add something like flight details, such as what you were capturing, beyond just a location, and then maybe even some footage storage locations. So if you're anything like me, you probably have tons of information and footage and media in general, meaning that you have a lot of hard drives. And so identifying those hard drives, labeling them, and then maybe even including that in your flight log or your logbook is something that I do so that it's helpful for me to identify where I can find that footage again. Logbooks, as can just like checklists, can be written, can be typed, they can be very, very detailed, or they can be quite simple. It's really up to you and what your intention is with those items and those pieces of documentation. Another company that I would like to bring up on this topic of logbooks is an app called AirData. And AirData is very helpful for managing multiple aircrafts or aircrafts that maybe don't have a logbook inside them. You can sync all the information from your individual aircrafts, compile them into some nice charts and sheets, and it's very helpful when trying to deliver a nice clean-cut document to a client who might want to see the flight logs of an aircraft. It's a little bit more rare, but I have had 2 companies specifically request information on the specific aircrafts that I plan to fly for the film shoot. So all super, super helpful things to at least keep on your radar. Now talking about insurance. Insurance it can be expensive. And so it's helpful to be aware that there are daily insurance premiums that you can apply for. And so instead of dealing with an annual cost of insurance, if you're maybe not able to justify that cost, or maybe you're just getting on your feet as a commercial remote pilot, then it can be helpful to get that daily coverage for when you are out shooting on different jobs. The 3 companies that have really gotten notable mention in the industry and other people who I've worked with or collaborated with are Skywatch, Verifly, and Skyviews. I personally have experience with Skyviews. They're super helpful, super friendly, and very quick to respond if I have any questions. They're also quite affordable. Verifly is known and referred to as more of a daily coverage entity. They have a app that you can download on your phone, and literally the day of, you can put some information in and get coverage from 20 minutes to a few hours. From what I'm aware about Skywatch is that they provide a little bit of a mix of both of these companies. Not only do they have annual premiums that you can get, but they also have those day-to-day, hour-by-hour coverage that you can apply for. I haven't had experience with Skywatch personally, but I have multiple people who I've worked with and who I've connected with that also fly drones that highly recommend Skywatch. So I just wanted to mention that to you guys, that they are on my radar to look into myself. It is required that you notify NTSB, or the National Transportation Safety Board, if you have an accident that causes $500 or more in damage to someone else's property. So they're not very concerned if you damage your drone and it's over $500, but they specifically want to know if you've damaged somebody else's property or if you've injured or hurt somebody else. And so just keeping that in mind, kind of falls into that concept of insurance and coverage. It's really just about managing your risk with accidents and what could come back on you financially. So absolutely worth considering getting. Now, moving into environmental considerations. When it comes to thinking about the environment as a remote pilot, there are two things that should come to your mind immediately. Number one is most likely weather for you. It should be, though, what is probably number two, which is airspace. So these two things are so important and directly affect the success of our flight, and also start to, we really want to be aware that we're engaging with other manned aircrafts when we are flying in airspace. So again, situational awareness, being mindful of what's happening around us and even beyond us when we're flying our drones is so, so, so important. Checking out the weather is a general standard practice as a drone pilot. For me personally, I became way more aware of what the weather was doing once I started flying drones. And even if I don't have a shoot going on, I love referencing it to plan, and I definitely integrate looking at the weather as a part of my pre-flight planning process. When it comes to weather, there are a couple of things that I would recommend using. The easiest is UAV Forecast app, which is super handy to have on your phone. The click of a button, you can see what's going on in real time and get an idea of, what to prepare yourself for. However, the go-to website that I use is called aviationweather.gov. And you're going to see a little graph at the bottom left corner of the screen here. And that to me is just so beautiful to see weather in this format of a graph like this, because it's not only showing you what's going to happen, what are the highs and the lows, what is the chance of precipitation, but it's literally giving you an hour by hour playthrough. And it also has little details like wind speed, wind gusts, and sky coverage. So even if you anticipate it to be a nice warm day, you can at least see, okay, when are there going to be the least amount of clouds during the day for the shoot? And you can start to plan accordingly. And then just really basic understanding of weather and polar temperatures when you're flying your drone is being mindful of, you have, freezing cold temperatures, and then you have extremely hot temperatures. And normally, in my personal experience, interestingly enough, the hot temperatures are the most difficult to manage equipment with. The hot temperatures are really what's causing my iPad to shut down, or causing my motors to get extremely hot to the touch, to almost the point where they're like gonna burn you if you accidentally touch them. So there's certain dangers that come with the heat. Yet when it's freezing cold, then you have a little bit more harshness happening to the pilot, right? So it gets a little more difficult to fly with your fingers, and I personally can't fly with gloves. I don't prefer to fly with gloves. And so there's that natural challenge of being out in really cold temperatures and still having to fly and have your skin exposed like that. But when it comes to ice, we don't really see so many mechanical or electronic issues come up. But what you will notice is that if you have this combination of fog and cold temperatures, freezing temperatures, you can get ice on your propellers. And if you get ice on your propellers, your aircraft has a hard time keeping itself lifted and keeping itself airborne. And so it will drop out of the sky pretty quickly once that ice starts to accumulate. So just quick briefing, on heat versus cold temperatures. Those are some things to keep in mind and keep in consideration. I want to dive a little bit more into airspace. You might have seen in that last slide that there was kind of these upside down wedding cake visuals, and that is more of a three-dimensional visual of airspace. But what you see on the screen now is really what we're going to be looking at when we're seeing and observing maps. And so we're taking some three-dimensional understanding and trying to put it on a 2D visual, which is why you're going to see so much like symbols and convolution happening in this bottom left visual. That bottom left picture is an actual sectional chart or map of the sky, and it has details from where the airports are, how high those different cake tiers or airspace tiers actually stand in elevation. And then it also says things about different obstacles in the air or in the area and how high they might be. But now we have what's called a LANCE system. We have multiple LANCE systems. LANCE stands for Low Altitude Authorization and Notification Capability. And this is a very nice electronic airspace map or airspace authorization system. So back in the day, which was probably back in 2016, you had to actually file for an airspace authorization if you were a commercial pilot and you needed to fly close to an airport. And sometimes those airspace authorizations could take anywhere from 30 to 90 days, depending on how busy they were and how important they might have felt that your operation was. But now you can get that authorization instantaneously through these LANCE systems, which is pretty phenomenal. And it's going to just condense a lot of information. So those two visuals on the left is going to show you a pretty dramatic difference between what you're going to see on the Before You Fly app versus a traditional sectional chart. And for us remote pilots, just managing a lot of that information is so helpful, since we aren't necessarily flying at 10,000 feet in the air, and we don't necessarily have to worry about flying over obstacles that are 1,200 feet into the air. We are supposed to be flying under 400 feet above ground level. And once you get closer and closer to an airport, that ceiling in which you're allowed to fly actually starts to get closer and closer to the ground. This is referencing a UAS facility map. So again, the closer you get to a airstrip, the lower to the ground they're going to want you to be flying. As you engage in this LANCE system or the Before You Fly app, as you click where you want to fly, it's going to tell you information as far as whether you're in controlled airspace and you need an authorization, or whether you're clear for takeoff and don't have to worry about it. And then it'll walk you through all the steps that you need to go through to get that authorization instantaneously, which is so awesome and super helpful when you're out and about and maybe didn't prepare to be in controlled airspace. So being mindful of these apps is very important. The primary apps that you're going to use for these airspace maps or LANCE systems is going to be the Before You Fly app, which is kind of hosted by the FAA, but the technology and the format is really catered to by a company called Aloft, which they have their own app. And once you start using the Before You Fly app, you'll notice that it's going to segue you to the Aloft app when you want to get a airspace authorization. So downloading that, highly recommend. Very key tool when you're a remote pilot. Now, I kind of mentioned this idea of external variables, and external variables is elaborated on specifically because it's the single most important aspect to pay attention to, since it is the one thing that could distract you from all the other risk elements. So if you remember those 4 risk elements that contribute to a situation, We have the pilot, the aircraft, the environment, and external variables. So just being mindful if there's anything unexpected that maybe comes up as an external variable, and notice if it's distracting you from all those other risk factors. That's why it's so important to pay attention. And it could be anything from, random dog coming up to you and barking to a person trying to talk to you and get an idea of what you're up to while you're in the middle of flying. So moving in towards the end of our presentation today, we're going to talk a little bit about flight simulations. So I'm going to talk about these, assuming that you understand what stick provides which control on the aircraft, or how your aircraft is going to respond to the inputs that you're putting in on those sticks that are on your transmitter or your remote controller. If you're not familiar with those, then I'm happy to provide some more information with that checklist for you to refer to. But once you start to understand what those sticks do, and really that right stick is what's going to make that aircraft go forward and back, left and right, and that left stick is what takes it up off the ground or makes it ascend versus coming down to the ground, descending. And then that left stick is also kind of making your aircraft turn its head almost. So from side to side, it's really adjusting the nose of the aircraft, which is that front end of the aircraft. And that's what's going to be affecting, there's also a term called heading, which might be used to identify that which direction that nose of the aircraft is pointing. But as you start to yaw, you're really affecting that heading orientation and position. So first two level flight simulations is what we're going to focus on today. Level 1 is all about smooth stick inputs. And we're more so focusing on getting off the ground, holding in a comfortable hover position, and then switching to that right stick and moving forward and back, left and right. If you're flying a mini drone, you're going to notice that hovering is a lot more difficult than the aircrafts that have position stabilization or position locking, also known as GPS. And hovering itself with mini drones becomes quite a task. I always start my students on mini drones because it is a little bit more difficult than a GPS aircraft or GPS drone. But if you don't have a mini drone, then hovering in one place isn't going to be much of a challenge. It doesn't necessarily need to be part of your practice. Then you would move into flying in a crosshair formation. And so that's really just flying the drone away from you a couple of feet, flying it back to you a couple of feet, and then moving it left and right. The intention is to have some smooth stick inputs that whole time. You'll notice if your aircraft is moving abruptly because you'll see it do some twitching to get back into position or to stop. And that's something that we're trying to manage, is that it visually looks like it's smooth and that you're in control of that aircraft. Once you've done a couple of crosshairs, then you might move into flying in a box formation. During this flight simulation, you have the nose of the drone pointing away from you at all times. So it's just pointing straight forward. There's two directions you can fly a box in. You might fly it clockwise and counterclockwise. I generally recommend flying 3 times clockwise and then 3 times counterclockwise. While you're flying these squares, it's also starting to challenge our depth perception a little bit. Usually we're flying the aircraft about chest height, maybe even hip height. And we might not have spaces in the air to determine how symmetrical our square actually is. So we have to use our peripheral vision to maybe identify a spot down in the grass, or you could even put some orange cones out for yourself to mark those corners of the square or the box that you're flying in. Ultimately, we're looking to have each line of flight be symmetrical to the others, and those nice, smooth, controlled stops when we get to every point. So that's level 1 as a flight simulation. Now, looking at level 2 flight simulation or flight pattern, we're really starting to test our understanding of heading orientation. So like I had mentioned, heading is that direction in which the nose of the aircraft is pointing. So we're going to start to challenge ourselves with that a little bit. We would start by turning the nose of the aircraft 90 degrees to the left or to the right. Then when you start to fly in your box formation, you might notice that the stick inputs on your right stick that make it go forward and back, left and right, are a little bit different than what we might perceive, since the aircraft is pointing in a different direction than that which we are looking. So this can be kind of a challenging level for people. However, as soon as students spend time on the second level of flight practice, it is amazing to see the confidence and the comfort that pilots acquire after this specific level. It really starts to take out that questioning and that second guessing, and it really starts to hone in that connection with your aircraft so that it does feel predictable and that you do know where it's going to go and how it's going to respond to your inputs. So this is probably one of the more important flight simulations out of all the ones that I teach. This one is a significant one. Now remember, all of these levels are accumulative. And so while you're adjusting your heading and you're still trying to fly in this box formation, you're also wanting to integrate that practice of the smooth stick inputs. Once you've changed the heading of your aircraft, from side to side, then you would try and fly with the aircraft having its nose in. So when you're flying these squares, you're going to have that nose of the aircraft pointing in one direction the whole time, and you're just flying in that box formation without turning the aircraft in any way. Again, you would fly 3 clockwise squares and then 3 counterclockwise squares. You can always spend more time on these if you feel that it's benefiting you. Usually, even as a practice pilot, when I go out on site, the first thing I do for my first flight of the day once I'm in the air is fly in that crosshair formation. Not only is it helpful to make sure that the aircraft is tuned and everything is going according to plan, but it also really helps me finesse my stick input and how hard I'm pressing on those sticks. As you become a remote pilot, I encourage you to observe how much strength we have in our hands and how much, I don't want to say hardness, but we use a lot of force when we use our hands. And rarely are we using the tips of our fingers and having sensitivity there. And so even as someone who's been flying for a few years, I enjoy flying in this crosshair formation because it helps me kind of dial back that pressure, tune in that sensitivity, and really lighten up on that stick input so that I can make sure that it's flowing and flying nice and smooth. That smooth stick input is also going to really benefit you if you're flying for videography purposes. Photography purposes can hide a little bit of that abrupt nature of our flight because we're able to stop in one position and take a single image from that. However, with video, as soon as you click record, you're constantly moving, and all of those movements are going to affect the experience of the viewer. So these are the first 2 flight simulations that I share in my company, Pilot EQ, for my students who are learning about flight operations. And I also see these just being 2 incredibly helpful and foundational practices, whether you're a recreational pilot or a commercial pilot. Again, my name is Danielle DeLeon. I really appreciate you all tuning in today. Please feel free to check out my website, piloteq.com, or send me a message if you have any questions regarding flight operations or acquiring your commercial license, or even honing in yourself as a freelance drone pilot. I'm absolutely happy to share any and all information that I've acquired through experience, while also kind of setting forth some general industry standards on the professional remote pilot realm. With all of that said, I want to open things up to a quick Q&A.